Okay. The Kara class. And I'm going to start off by saying something which is going to confuse a few people. These are the last real cruisers built by the Soviet Union. Why? Why am I saying that? Why, when there's the Slavas, the Kirovs, all to come next, the Slavas I'm doing tomorrow. Well, actually recording in about 5 minutes, but I'm doing them tomorrow. They're going to come out. It's going to come out. Why is it always so difficult to find a zero in this calendar? There is a reason for this. Cruisers, especially those produced by major powers, okay, are produced in a class. There are a class of cruisers. It's rare that you get ones or twos unless you're talking about bridging classes, things like the Wichita, etc., which are, or the Long Beach, which are basically built to test out a concept before you order the class. The Soviet Union is especially like this. In fact, the Soviet Union built entire classes. Usually it's about 4 ships as a bridging class, and they're evolving them as they go. That means that the Kirovs and the Slavas, which are 4 and 3 ships, respectively, in terms of completed units, are kind of small. More importantly than that, they are spread out. They become sort of capital units. You can argue that, well, yes, if they're building 2 classes of cruisers at the same time, you know, they don't need to build as many, so basically together they provide the same effect as one Kara class. But the Kara class provided 7 completed units. The same as the Kirovs and the Slavas put together. And they were launched in 1969, 1971, 1972, 1973, 1974, 1975, 1976. Well, that would suggest that there's definitely a very much a contiguous class of work going on at this point, isn't it? It's one class being built, and they're all built in the same yard. What's fun about the Soviet Union at this point is they basically build the Slavas in the same yard as this one, as the Karas, and the Kirovs also, I think some of them get built in the same. No, they don't. They get built in the Baltic yard, don't they? I was misspeaking. But there is this yard which is really critical, which has been churning out Soviet cruisers. And when I say it's really critical, it's been churning out Soviet cruisers. Well, the fact is, it churns out the Slavas and the Karas. This yard is in Ukraine. In Mykolaiv. It's a really, really good yard. It's required a lot of investment, a lot of development, and I think I was so worried about Mykolaiv, I pronounced it weirdly. Mykolaiv. Yes. Known as the 61 Communard shipyard point, still going, well, when I say still going to this day, was still going. It's it's a large facility. I'm not sure if I would consider it, considering where it is. I don't think it's still working as it once had, but certainly is a large facility. The Nikolov was the first of the class built. She has very little written about her. In fact, honestly, if the Kara class, for being a class which are basically the ultimate Soviet cruiser, with the Slavs and the Kirovs being something different, special, individual, you'd expect there to be far more written about them. And again, you get into the debate structures between the two great schools of thought. I would call them, well, basically, it's between the two Normans. Okay, so kind of like you seem to have a lot of Lamberts in various parts of history at the moment. In the 1990s, early 2000s, and the 1980s as well, you had naval history, especially the study of technological design, dominated, broadly speaking, by two Normans. They're still alive. Norman Freeman and Norman Palmer. They are wonderful. They both have their own focuses, okay? And the thing is, both has their own inclination in how they think and how they evaluate things. So, I will not say I agree with everything either one of them ever writes. I don't. But I agree with a lot what they write because it's well argued and well thought through. But they were the two big names debating the various discussion points of the Soviet cruisers. And one of the things you notice once you start to do some research in them is that the Karas, which come at the end of this cruiser run, before you get these big status units, they kind of almost brushed off as, oh, yeah, well, after this point, the Soviets decided to go absolutely absurd with their cruiser construction, and frankly, these were the last sensible ones, so we're just going to ignore them. And it kind of ignores the quality these ships produce. For example, for a class of 7 ships, the entirety in Norman Palmer's book, 5th edition, is this page and some pages of pictures which come after it. He even writes, operational. The Petroblashka Tashnet transferred to the Pacific Fleet in 1979 with the carrier Minsk. Tallinn transferred shortly after completion in 1981. The ships deployed to the Far East with empty electronic warfare ESM platforms. That equipment was installed later date. The Azov did not deploy out of the Black Sea until January 1988. She and the 3 other ships of the Black Sea Fleet regularly operated in the Mediterranean. Yet, also, these are the same ships he described as, these are large, graceful ships, a refinement of the Cresta II design, with major anti-air, anti-submarine capabilities. The Azov was an operational trial ship from the SAN-6 top-down air defense system. From a schedule viewpoint, they were built almost simultaneously with the Cresta II class constructed at the Zanov shipyard. I would agree. Cresta IIs are built between 1966, launched 1967 to 1976. And then these vessels start being launched in 1971 and get completely finished, final one launched in 1977. So what are the Kara class? What is coming out of this critical shipyard? A shipyard which has been around for a very, very long time. The first shipyard was started in the area in 1788, and it's been moved around, it seems, in that area, but it's basically been a functioning entity for since then. What are we building? What are the Kara class? Well, they're not built in the same yard as the Crestas, so seeing them simply as a continuation of the process through the Crestas would seem to be Kinders, Crestas, Cresta IIs, would seem to be a bit wrong. They're again, though, design-wise, they fit their mould completely. So what are we talking about? What is the debate? Why just going to skip over them. Honestly, because of the Soviet cruisers, These are divided into two main roles. The ones in the Black Sea I have discussed before in terms of other videos. The Soviet Navy knows its strategic circumstance. The ships in the Black Sea, like the ships in the Baltic, are isolated. They really can't do much. And their best hope for survival is that Turkey and Greece spend more time fighting each other than joining together and fighting them, because if they do, there isn't much space in the Black Sea to hide from the concentrated forces which will be deployed against them if they try and move anywhere far from shore. And even then, staying in port is not exactly safe when your opponent has long-range missiles as part of their arsenal. And the Pacific Fleet with a carrier, the Minsk, the Kiev-class carrier. Well, in fact, specifically, the Minsk is number 2 of the Kiev class and is one of the more important ships. Look at these vessels. They are roughly 8,200 tons standard, 9,700 tons fully loaded. So that's not far off really what a crown colony. Two shafts supplied by combined gas or gas. So, okay. Let me explain this. So, you've used to, and especially in ships, always had a cruising turbine and a high-speed turbine. That was part of the turbine set for most shafts. And that was sensible because you design a turbine to work its best at certain points. So you can design a cruising speed to work most efficiently at the cruising speed. Cruising turbine, cruising speed. And a high-pressure turbine. Okay, well, let's take this idea to... I've got an electric system and I want to boost my electric power. Well, hang on again. The turbines work efficiently at certain speeds. So, 2 cruising gas turbines that provide enough power for her cruising speed. And then 4 boost gas turbines that give her a full speed. So technically, 6 gas turbines. It works, and it's a system which will be used on the Slavas. Two quad SSN-14 Silex anti-submarine missiles. We've seen that system on the Crestas. 2 twin SAN-3 Goblet surface-to-air missiles launchers. Again, seen that on the Crestas. Gecko surface-to-air missile launchers. Haven't seen that so far in the series. 2 twin 76mm. Okay. 2 twin 530mm torpedo tubes. 24 SAN-6 Grumble surface-to-air missiles on Azov only. That's a later installation. K-25 or 27 series helicopter. There is another interesting role for a cruiser. And let's think this through. So, where are these ships deployed? What are these ships for? And what are they armed for? We have so far seen cruisers which are present ships, cruisers which can go sailing around the world, cruisers which are going to be status assets, cruisers which are going to provide with air defense, or cruisers which are going to provide all sorts of options in terms of anti-submarine warfare, anti-ship capabilities, cruisers which will be part of task groups. There is no surprise to me and to my mind that these are the vessels which go around with the Soviet carriers. Think about that. They're not an air defense asset, are they? They've got good air defense missiles, but that's nothing other ships don't bring to the table. They have got anti-surface systems, but again, nothing other ships don't bring to the table. Anti-submarine warfare systems, but again, nothing other ships don't bring to the table. What does this design bring to the table that the others don't? What does it bring to the table that the others don't? That is the question. And it starts off by looking at their complement, exactly the same again as the Cresters. Their radars, well, each one gets a slightly different, more fun fit, but they do have, and as I said, some of them get their fit a little bit later. But Norman, again, is a good source on this one. What is the purpose, though, of the Karas? And that's what this video is pretty much should be probably titled more. What does the sensors retail to us? This is why I shouldn't have put it down and closed the book, should I? Well, the sensors. Let's see. They have 2 bars tilt fire control, none in Azov. 1 big screen 3D air search in Kerch. A Don 2 or Palm Fond navigation radar. 2 Don K navigation radars. 2 headlight C fire control, 1 in Azov. 1 headnet C 3D air search. None in Kerch. A bullnose medium low frequency bow mounted sonar. A maretail medium frequency variable depth sonar. 2 Bell Cout electronic warfare systems as a rule. 2 Bell slams. 2 Bell tap except 4 rum tub in Kerch and Petrobras, and 8 side globes. Seriously, I love the names given for these systems. Basically, it's a case of, if you won't tell us what you're naming your secret system, we're going to give them names which are going to make them sound absolutely weird. Four operated in the Black Sea, 3 in the Pacific. Are these vessels built then to gloriously die? Well, the vessels in the Pacific with the carrier are an interesting formation. That suggests to me that you have built these ships to be part of, these are task group cruisers, and are built to try and work with your carrier. They are general purpose escorts. They haven't got a particular orientation in any way, shape or form. You have built them. They are the missile cruiser equivalent of, honestly, of the Crown Colonies and the Leanders. They are not built with a specific mission in mind. They're built to be all-rounders. And there is a maturity when you're building cruisers to do that. To go, we need this vessel to be a bigger version of everything we have, because we need that amount of firepower along to back up all the other ones. We need it to be able to backfill all the other roles. And that's really what this class is about. And the thing that really starts to tip you off about that is the inclusion of this missile. Yes. AK the Gecko, or the 9K-33 OSA. This is... well, a friend of mine once described it as the Soviet Seawolf. I'm not sure I agree with that. I find it difficult to agree with that because of looking at its own performance metrics. But I can see it sort of designed around that kind of mission. Because it does... it is able to go about 1,000 meters a second, which is pretty darn fast. And it is very, very capable in terms of its short range. It's 15 kilometers range, it's 12 kilometers in sort of maximum altitude. It's got a very high degree of accuracy, but I'm not really sure whether we call it Seawolf level degree of accuracy. considering the range and speed it's running at. But it is certainly building in a point defense system. It's starting to think about things in terms of your ship design, which are more than just dealing with aircraft, but also about dealing with the reality of being under a force which is going to be facing significant attack. If you think you're a solo ship going out to launch a last gasp missile attack on the enemy, or massive missile volley, you don't think about these sort of short-range weapons. These are about dealing with the enemy's missile attack, which you'll have already launched your missiles long before you receive. Your air defense missiles, long-range air defense missiles, they're about getting to the attacking position. These missiles are about surviving any counter. Well, what do you think about when you're surviving a counter? Probably what you're escorting, which might well be your carrier. Why are you thinking about that as a survival asset? As I've said before, carriers don't really fit the mold. In the Soviet video, which I've discussed, Soviets last, well, it came out on Saturday in the end because of the various problems I was having with recording software. The Soviet Navy, 1965 to 1991, if anyone wants to go and look at it. It's a good video, I think. I hope, anyway. The whole point with this system and putting this on and the defense of the carrier is when you start to think about things as being more than disposable assets and the situation you're facing. Now, the Black Sea again is an interesting scenario because you have 4 there. You have 3 in the Pacific where they're deployed and they work a lot with the carrier. Basically, wherever the Minsk goes, usually it seems to have 1 to 2 of these vessels with it for most of its early period of deployments. Some later on, sometimes they have other vessels, but most of the time, whenever it's going around, you will see, if you're reading the reports of NATO compiling of Minsk going around and doing its business, it will have this vessel with it, or that this pair of vessels, or this 2, or this 2. Usually 2 of the 3 will be with Minsk and will be going, we're here to make sure nothing happens to the carrier. Other vessels will join the task group or leave the task group, but there will usually be 2 of them sitting there with it. But you still have those vessels in the Black Sea. What are they for? What are the Black Sea vessels for? Well, they are something interesting, because starting to make that out made me have to look through a lot of facts, not just on this class, but on the other classes being built around them. Kerch, of course, is one of the Black Sea vessels, as is Nikolaev, Okhov, and Azov. Azov is, of course, the vessel which is the special one, which is adapted to serve as a template for later air defense and missile systems, which will be put on future ships. Petrovsk, Tasha, Tallinn. They're in the Pacific. They're basically Minsk escorts, and their job is to protect the carrier. They are capital asset protection vessels. They also do some presence mission. They do some visiting of high stakes areas and high threat areas. But again, these are capable vessels out there doing that. So what is Kerch for? What are these vessels for? Well, if we consider these vessels come about in the 1970s, when the Soviet Union is pushing for far more of a presence in Africa, in northern Africa especially, in the Suez region, in Syria, in all those things. This is a few years after the Middle East has really started to, well, how do I put this politely? Burn. What do I mean by this? Well, the Six-Day War happened, of course, in 1967, he says from memory. Yes, right. Sorry, I was mentally going 1966 or 67. It's 1967. And after that point, things start to get worse and more complicated, especially for America in the Middle East, in North Africa. There are a lot of forces who are very keen, not necessarily nations, but forces which are very keen for friendship with the Russians. This means you start having more of a presence and a capability wandering around. The Russians also start to consider the possibility, and they always seem to be more paranoid of this than I think the reality of it ever was, that their ships might be attacked by someone other than NATO. And these vessels going into the Mediterranean and largely operating from the Black Sea through to the Mediterranean, not sort of confined themselves to the Black Sea, but operating the Mediterranean, represented a acceptable increase in capability necessant to their operation in those regions. I.e., in the Mediterranean, you needed a high tier vessel. And as I said before, what is in your high threat and low threat scenarios? This is set scenarios. What is your high value units and high capability units versus low capability units changes. This is where the medium capability vessels come in. And to an extent, these vessels are pitched as higher level medium capability vessels. So they completely outswamp the need of their system, well, the needed systems for the Soviets to operate in the low threat areas, in the sort of the far out in the South Atlantic or wandering around the Indian Ocean, those sort of things. They don't need that. But when you're looking at the Mediterranean you cannot view as anything other than, from the Soviets' perspective, a high threat scenario. These vessels fit that role. They're also slightly more general purpose with those other missiles. It gives them a slightly better defensive parameter. But these are definitely vessels which are a continuation of the Soviet cruiser development. You can trace these vessels right back to the Kinders, and you can honestly trace them back to the Svoldovs. And honestly, you can trace them probably back. If you really look at some of that hull shaping design, you can go back as far as the Kirovs, if you really want to, the first generation one, the ones that started off this entire series on Soviet cruisers. But yeah, it's better to just trace them back to the Svoldovs. It gets slightly more tenuous the more in the gun cruisers you go. Yeah, slightly more. You're now reaching, okay? You're reaching a bit. Yeah, you've got hull patterns and shapings and forms going on, but yeah, leave it. These ships had interesting careers. Azov, especially interesting. Azov is modified. She's laid down in 72, launched in 73, and commissioned in 75. Now, in 1977, she's given the S-300F, the SAN-6 anti-air missile complex. This replaces her SAN-3 system, from memory. It's a good system, but it's led to most of the modern Soviet air defense systems are in some way related to this original S-300 family tree. But it's not necessarily in its fit on Azov the best fit. The ship wasn't designed for it. The ship wasn't built around it. It's basically has holes cut into it to fit it. And it works well. But not that well. Why are one of the brackets missing? There are things I will go back and change a slide over and then re-record. That I won't. So, this is what it looks like in the silos. Above, that's on a Slava class. And this is what the missile looks like. Now, there is a debate over the exact version S300 that she was fitted with. Because, and I say this politely, she has the fitting in 1977. Technically, the 5V55K and the 5V55R, which are the missiles which seem to be the ones of that generation, well, the K comes into service in 1978. So, there is some people have talked about in some of the books of a pre-K version, which is originally fitted to the Azov. But I think more than likely it's more a case of that just the K was available but not in massive numbers, so we don't see a major deployment of it. And so it's not really announced, but then it's now on the ship and it's already working, and I can understand, especially if you are making a big thing about this being your new super duper thing. I can understand you deciding, you know what, I'm going to wait a bit. I'm going to fit it and check it works before I make a big announcement. Plus, let's be honest, it's quite late in 1977 when she finally comes out. So it's almost 1978. Range for the missile was 47 to 75 kilometers. What is a debate? There's a lot of debates about this missile. It's honestly, it's one of the fun things is reading books like Norman Freeman's and Palmer's here, and reading their description of the missiles and just going, you guys were as hedging your bets as anything. And the first generation of missile is nowhere near the performance we see of later versions of the missiles. Later missiles are getting up to 150 kilometers, 195 kilometers. 200 kilometers, and there's one in 2000 which got to 400 kilometers apparently. So, well, those are the S400. So the missiles that we are talking about at this point are very much they're kind of like the original version of Patriot. It has a lot of promise. Like when you see, I don't know, 7-year-olds playing sports, and you don't want to say they're terrible, because they're really trying and they've got a lot of heart. So you say they have a lot of promise. They play with a lot of heart and have a lot of promise. And mentally inside you're thinking, they didn't manage to score one goal. I don't think any of the balls went anywhere near the goalposts. At all. But they were trying, so they played with a lot of heart and showed a lot of promise. Because they actually got the ball down the right end of the pitch. It's brilliant. I'm British. There are people in the southern states of America who think that it was Southern Americans who invented the term, bless your heart. No. There have been Cornish ladies using that phrase for centuries. Honestly, I could imagine one if a Soviet officer in 1978 had been bragging about this missile and its capabilities and going, it's brilliant. If one would have gone, bless your heart, dearie, have a scone. Wouldn't give them the proper thing. Give them a scone. But this is, of course, one of the Pacific class vessels. They're good. And as carrier escorts, they're pretty darn useful. And again, there is a point in having these ships for this. When you've got Udloys, when you've got the destroyers being built, they are stepping up to provide a lot of the escort, a lot of the capability roles, and the Caravacs and all these sort of vessels. But you still need the vessel which can fill in for everyone. And if you're going to have a ship which is going to have the size to accommodate the air defense systems and the anti-submarine systems, you're not going to end up with a small ship. This is again a debate you often hear. People go, well, what we need more smaller hulls. Yes, but inevitably you're going to then be faced with, what purpose is this hull going to do? Is it going to be an anti-submarine warfare escort or an anti-air escort? And by the way, you better hope you have enough that you can always guarantee you have an anti-air escort available and an anti-submarine escort available. Because if you don't, then you're going to be snookered. There was a discussion recently about whether or not the Royal Navy should build an all-frigate navy. And I was thinking about this discussion, conversations with people on the Discord server, and conversations about the Soviet ships. And this older person in the room, well, they're pretty darn experienced of these things. And they've been fighting to be heard for a long time, I have to admit. Because they kind of stick out in a room of British people discussing naval defence matters. Leaving that to one side, they turned around and said, no, the Royal Navy needs an all-destroyer navy. Which quite a few people went, oh. They turned around and said, no, because once you start building a frigate, everyone's going to think it's going to be anti-submarine warfare only, and it's going to end up with terrible air defence. If you build a destroyer, you can fit it with decent anti-submarine warfare capabilities, and you'll have the spacer hull, and you'll still have the air defence capability, so you actually end up with a general purpose asset. And honestly, I decided they were right. The power of the name. And this again comes back to the Soviet naming conventions. And they did really call these things cruiser. That's what they're there. The Soviets are reinventing a navy from scratch. They owe nothing to anyone when it comes to developing their navy. They really like to cast aside imperial traditions and all the conventions of the West when it suits them. So why are they so intent on keeping cruisers? Because it works as a role. Because it works as a necessity. The cruisers in the Mediterranean of this class, of the Clarke class, are sailing around being high-value presence assets. They're being the capability you need. If they eventually link up with a carrier, great. If they don't, they don't. But the very same class, with the very same capabilities in the Far East, are linked up with a carrier. Why? Because immediately, despite that carrier not being the world's best carrier, and because it is carrying the Yak 38 Forger, oh my lord! Here is something I'm going to say about the Yak 38 Forger, because people said I was unsure about it in one of the videos I talked about it, that I didn't give an accurate view of my feelings on it. Let me put it this way. If I had to pick which was a more useful aircraft in its period for the Navy which carried it, and I had the choice between the Blackburn or the Yak 38 Forger, then please, for the sake of your eyes, do not look up the Blackburn. I would pick the Blackburn. Because that could at least do the whole job it was supposed to do. The Yak 38 Forger, pretty much interception of airliner that are posing as long-range maritime patrol aircraft, is pretty much its job limitation. And even that's on a good day, with the right wind in the right direction. And preferably not too much sunlight. Not too much cloud either. The pilot had better have had a good breakfast. but also have not gone to the loo before getting airborne, because again, that's just not an option. And be very, very sure about their fingers, making them both very strong, because those switches are going to require a lot of work to do it, but also very small fingers, because the switches have to be very precise, and if you knock the wrong thing, you're going, yeah, the Yak 38 is not good. But the image of the carrier, the fact you have one, its own weaponry, combined with 3 of these sailing along, usually a couple of them, and suddenly you're looking at a ship and going, that's a task group. That is a task group. And that's a capability. And that's a capability we don't want to get into a fight with. We really don't. Because that's the sort of capability which is going to start hurting. Or rather, it's a capability which, when you go for, you are going to have to bring the full force to deal with it. Which, again, to me, is about a naval deterrence factor. It's a conventional deterrence factor. We spend most of our time when we're discussing the Cold War, we spend our time discussing nuclear war. Even today, when we start talking about the Soviet Union, the amount of people who are even people who are defense experts, but people, especially people who are not defense experts, who are asked about it because of their knowledge and preeminence in other scenarios, who immediately turn to nuclear war and nuclear weapons. Now, that is a very real risk. I've discussed this with the Talos and the Terrier missile systems on Long Beach, and the fact that those had nuclear capabilities, and there are many missiles on this class which have nuclear capabilities. It's one of those things when you start talking about the anti-submarine torpedoes and this and that, and you just go, well, yeah, they're not listed as anti-ship. Do they really need to be? When you've got that bigger warhead, just going off in the proximity of a ship is going to do the damage. You don't really need it to be specifically listed as being anti-ship. Being actually hit by that thing with a 20 kiloton nuclear warhead it's not going to give you a pleasant day. In fact, it's going to be a very short and very terminal significant emotional event. Let's be honest. But thinking that everything is going to go nuclear the moment you start reacting so far hasn't ever happened. Because conventional deterrence tends to lead up first before you get to unconventional deterrence, before you get to actual war and then nuclear war. Usually, as a rule. You have to be very worried when you are at the policy of you're dealing with someone who you think is going to jump straight to nuclear war. That means they're jumping through several steps. But conventional deterrence, admittedly wars aren't decided by logical people, but people thinking logically, they've usually gone down a very singular track of logic and can't find a way out. But that doesn't mean, I'm going to say this politely, that doesn't mean you stop thinking about conventional deterrence. And conventional deterrence is about risk thresholds. Now, this is where I am going to talk this through, and I know if some of my colleagues, etc., watch this, they're going to say, Alex, you're not using the right language. And I'm going to go, yes, I'm not, because that language is something which is discussed in academic circles, makes sense of the phraseology, and it's lovely, but that language is also a bit of a gatekeeper. So I am going to be using as much plain language as I can and explain the points where I can't. And that's where this class comes in, to me, in my mind. They're a conventional deterrence asset. They're about raising the risk level. You see, with the other vessels, with their air defense missiles and systems, you make a sudden attack, you might well overwhelm them. In which case, you have the sudden strike theory of war, where you can do the sudden strike and you can overwhelm your opponent and knock them out the way quickly, and then you've got what you can do what you want. Once ships start having self-defense missiles, etc., suddenly the likelihood of that sudden strike winning and succeeding becomes less. It does. It becomes less. And if the sudden strike won't win, you therefore have to think about what's the possibility of a longer war. Now, if you have one of these ships on its own, that's a potential. You have a task group around a significantly more valuable asset, and suddenly that means if you were thinking about sudden strike, you have to raise your level of force even higher. The amount of force you have to commit to make such a sudden strike successful becomes very visible. That visibility itself helps with your deterrence factor, because you can call out your opponent having to move. For example, if we consider the recent war scenario as it's flared up in, as I said, it's flared up in Ukraine. It's been going on since 2014, but as it's flared up, there are a lot of nations around the world calling Russia going, don't do this, because they were seeing the amount of force having to be organized. Why? Because the Ukrainians had mobilized and strengthened their forces to such an extent, the Russians had to mobilize far more forces in order to be able to overwhelm them. Or, in their minds, achieve that. They didn't, so far. I don't think they probably will, but you can never be 100% sure in any war. I don't like people making certain predictions in any conflict, because luck is always a factor. There are so many human factors involved, but luck is one of them. Someone looking the right way at the right time can ruin a plan. Someone stopping to have a bite to eat and a little stretch their legs, they've been driving so long, and they spot something that can unravel an entire operation which has been planned for months and turn a perfectly executed attack into an absolute, well, for want of a better phrase, death march. All these things are possible. So, if you build ships which have more capability of self-defense, and you group them together, you make them more difficult to attack. You raise the level of threshold. So you then stick that force into a position, you go, right, we care about this. If you want to push us out of the way, it's going to take a lot more force. And there's a lot more risk. And you're going to have to visibly bring in that force. At which point, all the complications start to mount up, and it becomes more and more better to go and negotiate. And that's basically conventional deterrence. Conventional deterrence is raising the point of the threat not to the point at which you are an overt military threat to your opponent, but raising it, or to the far side you're trying to stop doing their action, but raising the threat to such a point that they have to be so naked in their actions, they have to be so obvious in terms of the amount of force they're bringing in, that either they back themselves into a corner where they can only go down that route, and immediately they're going to know they're going to have to fight everyone, which is usually a deterrent to someone, usually a deterrent, or they come to the negotiating table. They decide they want talks. They usually through intermediaries they get someone neutral to announce, I want to hold the talks to resolve these issues. You can usually find a suitable intermediary. Usually the person you're looking for is the leader of a country who's not in any way connected to what events are going on, and who is sufficiently pompous to think they might afford it themselves and think of it as a scenario for them to grandstand on the world stage. In other words, a politician. You can usually find them by the dozen. Pick. But that only works if you're actually able to deploy the forces. If you can't deploy forces, this was, again, if we go back to one of the scenarios with Ukraine, there's all sorts of people making promises that they're going to look after them, support them, but the actual rule of logistics and the scenario of the Black Sea means you can't actually get anything to them. So you can't do this. You can't do this deterrent. The Black Sea, it works both for Russia in that scenario, and it works against the Soviet Union in the same scenario. But this is how you do conventional deterrence. And these ships, to me, the other ships, especially the Krestas, twos, to example, and Sveldovs, are about the global Soviet Union, about its global status, about it going out, it being approaching people, it being this big, powerful power, going and showing off the power, showing off the status, showing how good the Soviet system works, and going, wouldn't you like some? Wouldn't you like to be part of this? These ships are about consolidating that. And that's why they don't get deployed out as much, and that's why they're mainly seen in the Mediterranean and in the Pacific with their carrier, because they're about the force which is consolidating, is deterring others from getting involved in those areas if they want them. They're the deployment force, the reaction force. That's my feeling looking at them. And looking at their deployments. Now, even once they stop serving, they still are put to use. And this is one of the reasons why I have brought up Ukraine as much as I have in this. Not only were they built there, you have the fact that Oksha was used in 2014 as a block ship in the channel to Donzlov Lake to stop the Ukrainian fleet escaping Sevastopol. In 2000, she'd been laid up for modification repairs. And in 2006, after 6 years of not doing anything, all work was officially halted, and ship was towed from Morzad. And in 2011, it was prepared to be sold for scrap. But in 2014, she's still around, and she's sunk as a block ship to block the Ukrainian ships from getting to the Black Sea. I'm not sure if she has actually been scrapped by now. But it makes sense for this ship's most famous action to have been something that happened after it had been got rid of. These ships were never going to be the ones going around the world being the status symbols, despite their power and their capabilities. They were always going to be deployed as force deterrent assets. And deterrence is never as sexy or as popular or as loud as presence. Interesting enough, presence is a form of deterrence. Presence is a form of deterrence, but it's there are levels. Presence is you're saying we're here, we're interested. Then there's a bigger unit turns up, goes, we're really interested, and we're really visible. And then a task group turns up. And that's more a case of everyone's going to be focusing on the task group asset, on the carrier, or with the Soviets, the Kirov, or sometimes the Slava. The big thing which is turned up in the center of task group going, yeah, I'm here with my mighty force. And that's when the Karas turn up, because they're part of that mighty force. And they're really what give that mighty force its backbone. They're not the headliner, but they're at the backbone of those mighty forces. That's the Christmas list. That's what you want to see. Long Beach came out yesterday. Slava comes out tomorrow. Warrior on Thursday. It's going to be fun. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. And normally I end these with a question. Normally I do end these with a question. But this one, I'd just like to hear your thoughts on the Soviet cruiser systems, because I said, for me, the Slavas are more another form of capital ship because of their rate and pace of construction. They are sort of fill-ins for the Kirovs. So I'd like to hear what you think about the Soviet cruisers as a whole. Whether you think any of the lessons or any of their design practices would you'd like to see. And I'd love to hear whether you think the Russians will ever build cruisers again. There's a debate as to whether they have the yards or capacity to. They're certainly churning out frigates, although not completing that many at the moment. Still having troubles with the gas turbines, I hear. Ah well, they'll get there soon, I'm sure. Or at least they'll look like they are. Thank you very much, everyone. Take care, and hope you enjoyed.